Dichiaro aperta questa.
So, I declare this extraordinary meeting of the Conference of Presidents open. For the first time, the meeting is being web-streamed. The reason why the meeting is being web-streamed is the presence of Mr. Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook. The meeting will conclude at 7:30.
For accepting our invitation. This is an important mark of respect towards the European Parliament and the European citizens that are represented here. In this room, all political groups are present. Here you can explain what happened, inform them of what you have done to solve the problem and answer their questions. A questa riunione.
Today's meeting will be followed by a public hearing on the issues raised by the Libe Committee a few weeks ago with the cooperation of other competent committees. They want to go into the more technical aspects of these questions, so it will be a proper hearing. In exactly 1 year's time, 400 million Europeans will be voting. They will be selecting their representatives in this parliament, and we hope that each of those votes will be genuinely a free vote. After the Cambridge Analytica scandal about the illegal harvesting of personal data in order to influence electoral results, is an alarming scandal, and I think our citizens deserve a detailed explanation of what took place. That's why we've invited Mr. Zuckerberg to be present with us here this afternoon. I hope that all of the other digital platforms will also be cooperating with our Parliament. Our citizens should vote on the basis of true and accurate information. They want to know that their personal data is never used to unduly manipulate democratic processes. User-generated data has become a valuable resource, and people are prepared to pay large amounts of money for this data. The price paid by the users is in many cases data in exchange for free services. However, democracy should never become a marketing operation where anyone who buys our data can buy political advantage. Within and without the European Union, there are people who want to use this data in a fraudulent manner. 99% of Europe's citizens have come across some kind of fake news on social media platforms. Many people feel that fake news is a threat to democracy. That's why we want the major digital companies to respect the rules for the harvesting and use of our data. In a few days, the General Data Protection Regulation will enter into force. This is a very advanced regulation which will prevent abuse of personal data. Today's meeting is just a starting point as we move towards a new form of governance for digital platforms. We are the regulators, and at the conclusion of the hearings that will be taking place, the Parliament will be pointing out solutions that digital platforms should adopt to ensure that all future elections are free from a risk of manipulation. We need to define, as soon as possible, a set of rules that will allow for the proper functioning of the digital market. This will mean new responsibilities for operators and new rules for privacy, copyright, and consumer rights. We do not want to do without social media, but we want to be able to use digital platforms without any danger to our personal privacy or even our security. There is the issue of terrorism out there, and I'm sure that Mr. Zuckerberg will also say a few words about this situation. All too many terrorists have got in contact through the social media platforms. We need to prevent this from happening again in future. Europe and the whole world are under attack. This represents an attack on our fundamental values. Racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia. We need to ensure that these kinds of things do not continue to happen on the social media. Social media companies need to react. What we're asking of them is that they contribute in a determined manner and state what they intend to do. Before we get down to the details, I'll start by giving the floor to him so that he has an opportunity to explain what has happened, what he intends to do, and what choices his company is making. So we'll go through the groups in the usual order. We'll start with the chair of the Civil Liberties Committee. And I will give you about 3 minutes each for your question so you get a chance to have a response. So I'll give the floor to Mr. Zuckerberg so that he can explain his views, and then we'll pass on to the questions.
Thank you. President Tajani, honorable members of the European Parliament, it's good to be back in Europe. Thank you for inviting me here today for this important discussion. Now, Europeans make up a large and incredibly important part of our global community, and many of the values that Europeans care about deeply are values that we share, from the importance of human rights and the need for community, to the love of technology and all the potential that it can bring. Now, we've always focused on all the good that technology and connecting people can bring. And as Facebook has grown, it has helped give people everywhere around the world new tools to stay connected to the people they care about most. After the recent terrorist attacks in Berlin and Paris, London, and here in Brussels, tens of thousands of people have used our safety check tool to tell the people they love that they're safe. Refugees arriving in Europe are using Facebook to stay in touch with their loved ones back home and find new communities here. There are 18 million small businesses here in Europe that use Facebook today, mostly for free, almost half of whom say that they have hired more people as a result of their use of our tools. But it's also become clear over the last couple of years that we haven't done enough to prevent these tools from being used for harm as well. And that goes for fake news, foreign interference in elections, and developers misusing people's information. We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a mistake, and I'm sorry for it. It's going to take time to work through all of the changes that we need to make here, but I'm committed to getting this right and to making the significant investments that are necessary to keep people safe. For example, we are doubling the number of people working on safety and security at our company to more than 20,000 by the end of this year. On top of the investments that we're making in other areas, I expect that these increased investments in security will significantly impact our profitability. But I want to be clear. Keeping people safe will always be more important than maximizing our profits. Now let me start by explaining the action we're taking to prevent what happened with Cambridge Analytica from happening again. Back in 2014, we changed our policies to more tightly restrict the information that apps could get and to proactively review all apps asking for more data. So now we're going to go even further than this. First, when you use an app, it's now only going to get limited access to your information, your name, your profile photo, and your email address, unless they've gone through a full review. So that's much less information than apps can get on mobile platforms today. Second, if you haven't used an app in 3 months, we're going to prevent that app from accessing your information until you authorize it again. Third, last month, we showed everyone on the top of their newsfeed a tool with a list of all of the apps that they've used, as well as a simple way to remove permissions for any apps that they no longer want to access. Finally, we're investigating every single app that had access to a large amount of people's information before we locked down our platform in 2014. And where we have concerns, we're going to conduct an audit and suspend the app. And if we conclude that people's personal data was misused, we will ban the app and the developer completely and tell everyone who is affected. So far, we've investigated thousands of apps, and we've suspended more than 200. As we work to protect people's information, we also need to give people more control. At the heart of Europe's new data protection law, the GDPR, are three important principles: control, transparency, and accountability. And we've always shared these values and given people the ability to control what information they share and who they share it with. And now, we're going even further to comply with these strong new rules. We're making the same controls and settings available to people who use Facebook around the world. In addition to GDPR, we're also working to give people important new controls. For example, in your web browser, you already have a simple way to clear your cookies and browsing history. So we're building a version of this for Facebook too, that we're calling Clear History. It will enable you to see the information we receive from websites and apps when you use them, and to clear this information from your account and turn off the ability to store it associated with your account going forward. Now, when you clear your cookies in your web browser, that can make your browsing experience worse. You may have to sign back into every website that you use, and clearing your history on Facebook may make parts of your experience worse too. But this is an example of the kind of control that we think that people should have, and something that privacy advocates and regulators, especially here in Europe, have long called for. Now let's turn to elections. In the next 18 months, there are important elections globally, including many here in Europe, as well as for the European Parliament, the United States, Brazil, India, and Indonesia. In 2016, we were too slow to identify Russian interference on Facebook in the US presidential election. At the time, we were more focused on more traditional kinds of cyber attacks, like phishing and malware. And we identified those and we told people. But we weren't prepared enough for the kind of coordinated misinformation operations that we are now aware of. So since then, we've made significant investments to protect the integrity of elections by making these kinds of attacks much harder to do on Facebook. And I have more confidence that we're going to get this right going forward because we've already done a better job in several important elections since 2016, including the French presidential election, the German elections, and the Alabama special election in the US last year. We're working with governments and other technology companies to share information about threats in real time. So for example, in Germany, before the 2017 elections, we worked directly with the German Federal Office for Information Security. We're also using new technology, including AI, to remove fake accounts that are responsible for much of the false news, misinformation, and bad ads that people can see on Facebook. In the run-up to the 2017 French presidential election, our systems found and took down more than 30,000 fake accounts. And in the Alabama special election in the US, we were able to proactively detect and remove fake accounts from Macedonia that were trying to spread misinformation. Now, it's worth adding that a lot of fake news is economically motivated, not politically motivated. Right? It's much like email spam in that way. The playbook for fighting this is removing the ways in which spammers can make money, so then they just go and do something else. So to do this, we've banned sites that regularly run fake news from using our ads products so they can't make money from it. We've built our systems to penalize clickbait and sensationalism. And we also reduce the distribution of stories in newsfeed that have been rated as false by third-party fact-checkers. Finally, we're making advertising on Facebook much more transparent. So we built a new tool that lets you see all of the ads that any page is running. So now you can see all of the different messages that an advertiser or a political actor are sending to all of the different audiences that they're trying to reach. We're now testing this in Canada and Ireland, and we're going to launch it globally this summer. Increased transparency is going to lead to increased accountability and responsibility for all advertisers on our systems over time. Now, security is not a problem that you can ever fully solve. We face sophisticated, well-funded adversaries who are constantly evolving. But we're committed to continuing to invest heavily and improving our techniques to make sure that we stay ahead. And we're going to keep building tools to help more people make their voices heard in the democratic process as well. In addition to working on election integrity, Facebook plays a positive role in elections around the world by helping leaders like all of you connect directly with voters. And our Get Out the Vote efforts have helped millions of people register around the world who may have not gone to the polls otherwise. I am determined to keep building tools that bring people together in meaningful new ways while we work to address our safety and security challenges as well. We're very committed to Europe. Almost 400 million people in Europe rely on our services to connect and communicate with their friends and the communities that matter most to them. Dublin is home to our European headquarters. London is home to our biggest engineering team outside of the United States. Paris is home to a big part of our artificial intelligence research. And we have data centers in Sweden and Ireland, and we're building a new one in Denmark that will come online in 2020. By the end of 2018, Facebook will employ 10,000 people across 12 European cities, up from 7,000 today. And we will continue to invest in Europe in the years ahead, including we've committed to providing 1 million people and small businesses with digital skills training by 2020. Now, my priority has always been our social mission of connecting people, helping people build communities, and working to bring the world closer together. And I believe deeply in what we're doing. And when we address these challenges, I know that we're going to look back and view helping people connect and giving more people a voice as a positive force, both here in Europe and around the world. So thank you for inviting me to the European Parliament today, and I am ready to take your questions, which I'm looking forward to hearing, and I'll answer together at the end.
Thank you. The first speaker is Manfred Weber, Chair of the Group of the European People Party. You have the floor.
Mr. Zuckerberg, welcome to the European Parliament, and I want to thank also our President Tajani for organizing this meeting. To apologize is a good thing, and it is absolutely needed. Consumers in Europe are worried, disappointed, concerned about what happened, and that's why it's great that you're here, you're present, you're showing respect toward the EU consumers. That is a good, positive signal. But you know that this is not enough, and you said this in your presentation. Now it's about acting. The implementation of the data protection rules, which will get into force this week, is an important step. It's good that you are implementing now the rules we are setting, and it's also good to hear for us as European lawmakers that they are using the European data protection rules for global standards. So that's good to know, and it's good to see. In this regard of this acting aspect, I have two very concrete questions, first of all. The first question is about when you recognized the scandal about Cambridge Analytica, you decided to stop the access of some of your business partners to the database of Facebook. You said this in your presentation also today. I want to ask you, why didn't you do it for all the business partners? So my first concrete question is Cambridge Analytica an isolated case, or would you say it's the top of the iceberg? So the concrete question is, can you guarantee to the Europeans that another scandal will not happen in 3, 6, or 9 months' time? A second point in regard to this question of acting is, and there I want to make a follow-up of the questions in Washington. Our colleagues did already a great job there. Senator Kamala Harris asked whether you personally made the decision in December 2015, when you became aware about the Cambridge Analytica data breach, to not notify your users. Because that is, I think, an extremely important point. Transparency, that the people know what is happening with the data, is crucial for us as Europeans. So were you informed, and why no information to the users? That are the two questions I want to put on the table on the scandal itself. I think our LIBE colleagues will do a follow-up on this. That's why I want to also come to a more general reflection on Facebook and what it means for our societies. Your company has already today a tremendous power. You know this. For example, the question: who is number one on the messages, and who is number 10, who is number 100? There you have an algorithm behind, and these rules are incomprehensible for the moment. Nobody knows about them. We should, I think, discuss about the laws that oblige you to make these algorithms public in the future. Because when you have so much power about who is visible in the social media and who is not visible, that cannot be longer anymore a decision of a company. That is, I think, a decision for our societies. I think this is necessary, and I'm interested in your arguments why we shouldn't do so. And in addition, I want to underline that between Europe and America, we have different understanding about what is allowed to publish and what is not allowed to publish. In Europe, for example, the question of videos and texts on radicalization by Islamists or the glorification of Nazi propaganda is unacceptable for us in Europe. In America, a lot of people would say that is covered by freedom of expression. So I see a lot of member states for the moment asking Facebook to voluntarily ban these messages. I think that is very submissive. We should not ask the company to do so, to delete it. I think we should clearly regulate clear rules, what is allowed in social networks in Europe and what not. And finally, during your testimony before the Congress, Senator Lindsey Graham asked you repeatedly the name of only one of your competitors, only one, without success. Probably you can give us today for the European market a competitor. Probably there is one in Europe if there is nobody in America. Is there today in Europe an alternative to Facebook for the services you are offering? WhatsApp and Instagram are already part of your empire. Would you consider your company as a monopoly? And I have to say, as a politician, I believe in markets and rules, but I also want to stop all kinds of possible monopolies. And that's why I think it is time to discuss breaking Facebook monopoly, because it's already too much power in only one hand. So I ask you simply, and that is my final question, can you convince me not to do so?
And now Mr. Udo Bullmann, chair of the group, the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament. You have the floor.
Mr. Zuckerberg, the reason we talk today is that your business practices allowed for the abuse of private data and for the misuse in order to manipulate for political purposes. You have mentioned the progress in European legislation. Are you ready to completely comply with the new regulation in Europe within the next 3 days? Because this is the 25th of this month when the General Data Protection Regulation enters into force. Can you guarantee that Facebook is in line with the new rules, and can you guarantee that you will not collect, use and sell any data to third parties without proper consent? Especially if people want to come off Facebook, how quickly and under what conditions will their data be fully removed? We would like to know, how can you explain that the amount of false accounts is in a rise? In 2017, Facebook reported that 2 to 3% of all accounts were false accounts. In 2018, this is now 3 to 4%. what is Facebook doing to tackle the spread of especially sophisticated fake accounts, which allow for abuse of all sorts, especially when it comes to political manipulation? And can you perhaps give us the number of fake accounts that you have been deleted so far this year? I'm personally interested in the question of the forthcoming European elections. You mentioned experiences in France and in Germany, which came into existence under the pressure of the respective governments. How can you and will you guarantee that no manipulation from foreign and hostile interference sides of the democratic process of your platform ahead of the forthcoming vote can happen? Are you ready to guarantee that for the whole European Union? And in which way will you adapt your business model that can be prohibited from the very instance? I firmly believe that we are at the crossroads and in a critical situation, because your business practices touched upon two basic values of our societies. First of all, the personal data, which became perhaps the most important asset in modern media society. And secondly, on the right of self-government of sovereign nations. This is what it is about, and we are looking for your answers.
And now, Mr. Kamal, co-chair of the European Conservative Group. You have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. Zuckerberg, thank you very much for coming to the European Parliament today and for agreeing to send your legal and technical experts to the Civil Liberties Committee. And can I also thank those here in the Parliament who have made this meeting possible. Now, please rest assured, I'm not here to try and score any cheap political points or to do any stunts here, but I want to concentrate what is important for the many people who have contacted me when they knew I would be here in the room today. Look, I'm a libertarian-minded conservative, and I believe in market-led solutions and that bureaucracy shouldn't starve innovation. I'm also very tech-oriented. I quite often joke that I used to be a geek. I'm now the father of geeks. But where business takes advantage of their users or consumers, then they come to us as politicians and they expect us to do something. They at least say something, but also do something. And what happened with the Cambridge Analytica case has quite rightly raised serious concerns. Now, many of us use social media. Indeed, I crowdsourced some of the questions today using social media before I came here. But what's really interesting has been the public outcry over so-called shadow profiles, where Facebook collects and stores data about internet users that don't have or use Facebook. Now, I understand that Facebook admits that you collect this data and then store it for about 10 days. But given that this data is collected continuously and that most people use the internet almost every day, then in effect this becomes a continuous cycle. Now, I believe in self-responsibility, and I know that by having my own Facebook account, I have to take some responsibility for what I put on my own Facebook account. But what happens if I don't have a Facebook account? Is the only way of preventing Facebook collecting my data to avoid the internet altogether? Or is there another way? How can non-users stop Facebook collecting their data? And what do you do with the non-Facebook data? Do you commercialize it? And given you do that, is it morally acceptable, do you think, in your opinion, to collect non-Facebook users' data without them knowing what you do with it? And are they able, if I'm a non-Facebook user, am I able to see the data that you've collected on me? And if not, why not? Thank you. I look forward to your answers.
And now, Mr. Giverhofstadt, the chair of the group. Mr. Giverhofstadt, the chair of the group of the Alliance of the Liberals and Democrats in Europe. You have the floor.
Thank you, President. First of all, my apologies. I came in the middle of your explanation, but I was saved by Facebook Live. So I followed you on Facebook Live, and that was my rescue today because of strikes in Paris. So I have to tell you, Mr. Zuckerberg, you remember me, in fact, a protagonist of a book. Maybe you know that book, and the name of the protagonist, Mr. Calden. Calden is the protagonist in a book of Dave Eggert, as you know, The Circle. And in that book, it's about a big data company who is out of control. Not even the owner has control on it. And that data is used in elections. And it seems me very, very near to the reality. Also, the fact that maybe you have less control or no control about your own company for the moment, because you have to apologize now. I think in total, you apologize now 15 or 16 times the last decade. In 2003, you started. Every year, you have one or other wrongdoing or problem with Facebook, and you have to face the reality and to say sorry and to say that you're going to fix it. Last year, I think it was twice that you apologized, and this year, 3 times already, and we are still in the month of May, so it's a little bit early in the year. So what my point is about that is, are you capable to fix it? And if you have already confronted so many dysfunctions of the system, there has to be clearly a problem. And the only way, in my opinion, to do it, and I'm a liberal, a free marketeer, is to have public regulation to do so. It's a little bit like with the banks in the 2006, 2007, 2008. They said also, no, we're going to do self-regulation. Don't bother. No, we're going to do it ourselves. The reality is that they didn't do them themselves, and it was needed to have tough regulation. I have here an Avas petition where 1 million, more than 1 million citizens in Europe ask you to do that and to accept regulation and not to continue with the idea, oh, we're going to self-regulate. And I come then to my concrete questions. The first is about the GDPR and European privacy standards. You have told that you're going to apply them, but are you telling the truth, in fact, to us? Are you telling the truth? Because since the outbreak of Cambridge Analytica, you have massively transferred European data of non-European citizens out from Europe, away from the European service to service otherwise in Europe. I have to tell you, that's against the regulation, against GDPR, and against the existing directive in Europe, 95/46, who is still applicable. And the same that what Mr. Kamal is saying is happening, in fact, with European non-Facebook users who are, in fact, collected by you. And that's also against illegal in Europe, against the regulation. The second point is Article 82 of the GDPR. You know, you have to know, Article 82 gives the possibility of compensation if there is a problem, if Facebook users were abused. May I ask you, have you an idea, will you compensate the European Facebook users as foreseen in Article 82 of GDPR? Concrete question. And what will be the amount that you will give them? Maybe the value that they have with their profile. My value, I have examined it. My value as Facebook user is $186. I thought it was more, but maybe my wife thinks it's less. It could be less. So my opponents think it's less. But maybe it's a good basis. What their value is as profile could be the compensation that you give to these people based on a regulation. And my third point is about, Mr. Weber said it already, and I think he's right, you cannot convince him because it's nonsense, naturally. You have given the example of Twitter, you have given the example, I think, also of Google, as some of your competitors, but it's like somebody who has a monopoly in making cars is saying, look, I have a monopoly making cars, but there is no problem. You can take a plane. You can take a train. You can even take your bike. So I have no monopoly. So there is a problem there. And I have two specific questions there. Could you or would you cooperate with the European antitrust authorities to examine it and to open your books so that we can see if yes or no there is a monopoly? And secondly, if you have to split off, for example, Facebook Messenger, to give you an example, and WhatsApp, and to keep then Instagram, should that be a good deal for you that you could accept? So finally, that's my last point, is on a more personal note. I really think we have a big problem here. And it's not solved by saying we're going to fix it ourselves. And you have to ask yourself how you will be remembered. as one of the three big internet giants, together with Steve Jobs, I should say, and Bill Gates, who have enriched our world and our societies? Or on the other hand, in fact, a genius who created a digital monster that is destroying our democracies and our societies for the moment? That's a question that you have to put for yourself.
Okay, thank you. And now Mr. Lamberts, co-chair of the group of the Greens. You have the floor.
Yes, Mr. Zuckerberg, welcome. I'll be straight. I have 6 binary questions. I gave copy to Mr. Kaplan. First of them, will Facebook commit to systematically and publicly release data on all politically relevant advertising in all electoral campaigns or referendum campaigns, such as Brexit, or the campaign we have now in Ireland on abortion, including the amounts, their sources, and their targets? Yes or no? Will Facebook develop a mode of operation that allows Facebook users to completely opt out of targeted advertising? Yes or no? Referring to the figures that Udo Bullmann quoted on fake accounts, will Facebook commit to 1, eradicate all remaining fake accounts by the end of the quarter, and B, systematically prevent the creation of new ones moving forward? 4th question, does Facebook provide media or curated content, or on the contrary, is Facebook a neutral platform? Here you have to choose one of the 2 options. 5th question, will Facebook voluntarily commit, as from 2018, to publish the list of its legal entities, the number of people they employ, their turnover, their profits or losses, and the taxes they pay or subsidies they receive on a country-by-country basis? And finally, will Facebook commit to pay taxes where it operates, and generalize the commitment you apparently recently made to the French authorities no longer to channel the profits made in that country through Ireland or other tax havens? These are my 6 binary questions. I would welcome simple answers to them.
Can I ask you to repeat the second question? I missed that.
The second one is, will Facebook develop a mode of operation that allows end users to completely opt out of targeted advertising? And what would be the conditions for them? But will you develop that option? As a user, I might be interested.
The next speaker is Mrs. Zimmer, chair of the Confederal Group of the European United Left, Nordic Green Left. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, but I would like to speak in German. Herr Zuckerberg.
Mr. Zuckerberg, we have this meeting now, but I wonder why originally it wasn't possible to have an open public meeting, why we couldn't have had the participation of more members of the different committees, so that we could have had a proper discussion. I wonder why you refused that option. I think you have spoken about transparency, for example, about bringing communities together as that being the basis of your platform. So I think that kind of approach would have been important for us. You talked about communication platform, about having a social mission for the platform, that it should make the world a more open place. And now, 14 years later, I can follow on from what a lot of my colleagues have said, that these platforms have changed. There's a lot more fake news based information. The communities have gotten smaller. You have a very narrow view of the world, people in their own little groups. If we look at the situation in Germany, in Europe, that's probably something that can still be compensated through public debate. But when we have these misinformation campaigns, these fake news that come through Facebook, for people in other parts of the world, this can be deadly. We have seen these types of cases on Facebook that have led to the deaths of people. So I have really very serious concerns as to whether the Facebook business model can really be significantly changed and brought back to its original mission as a communications platform. If we look at Goethe, for example, we have to think about what it's become. Is it still something which is manageable, controllable? Can you really give us a serious answer to this question? On the 25th of May, we will have the General Data Protection Regulation, which will enter into force. We've had a lot of information that Facebook supports this, but is this the case? Have you really taken 1.5 billion people outside of the effective reach of our regulation, people from other parts of the world who were previously covered that now will not be covered? So is that true, that figure, that this regulation will no longer apply to these people? When you said that the regulation would be implemented in spirit, what does that mean exactly? Over the last few years, there have been a large number of meetings with high-ranking Facebook officials within the EU, with different commissioners, for example, different members of the EU. I think 92 different meetings altogether. Millions has been spent on lobbying work here in the EU as well, to try and postpone the data protection regulation. Is this really in the interests of Facebook? I think we have to think about the relationship between power and society here. And then just one very last question that might not seem important to many, but it is important to me. Facebook was originally founded as a hot or not platform for students to evaluate students on their attractiveness. This was a very long time ago, of course. But I would like to know that how has Facebook's philosophy changed in the meantime, looking at discrimination against women, sexism, violence against women, etc. Thank you very much.
Onorevole Zimmer, solo per sua...
Well, Mrs. Zimmer, just to inform you and clarify things for you, Mr. Zuckerberg has been invited to take part in a Conference of Presidents meeting. He's never refused to take part in any meeting. When he accepted the invitation to attend, I simply asked him whether he would allow the meeting to be web streamed, and he said yes. So I don't have any criticisms on that front, but I just thought it was important to set the record straight. And I give the floor to Mr. Farage, chair of the Europe Freedom and Direct Democracy Group.
User of Facebook in all the European institutions in terms of followers.
Okay, I'll start again. Mr. Zuckerberg, I'm the largest user of Facebook in all the EU institutions in terms of followers, in terms of engagement, so I'm your best client here in the room. I've no idea of the value of that, but I'm pleased to see you, as I hope you are me. The one slight problem I have, and I'm watching very carefully the testimony that you gave on Capitol Hill. Time and again, people asked you, is this genuinely a neutral political platform? And you come up with the same line again and again. It's well crafted. You say that Facebook is a platform for all ideas. Now, historically, of course, it's true that through Facebook and other forms of social media, there is no way that Brexit or Trump or the Italian elections could ever possibly have happened. It was social media that allowed people to get round the back of mainstream media. Now, perhaps you're horrified by this creation of yours and what it's led to. I don't know. But what is absolutely true is that since January of this year, you've changed your modus operandi, you've changed your algorithms, and it has led directly to a very substantial drop in views and engagements for those that have got right of centre political opinions. The facts are very clear. Just look at President Trump's numbers on a much smaller scale. Look at mine. Look at thousands of other conservative commentators. And on average, we're down about 25% over the course of this year. And, you know, that's happening on a platform for all ideas. I'm not talking here, Mr. Zuckerberg, about extremism. I'm not talking about encouraging violence. I'm not talking about hatred of anybody. I'm talking about people who have majority mainstream opinions, and frankly, I feel they are being willfully discriminated against. What interests me is who decides what is acceptable? Who are these people you referred to earlier, these third-party fact-checkers? Who are these people? I mean, why is there no transparency in this process at all? I'm not generally somebody that calls for legislation on the international stage, but I'm beginning to wonder whether we need a social media Bill of Rights to basically protect free speech. And I'm asking you today very, very clearly that would you accept that today Facebook is not a platform for all ideas that is operated impartially?
Thank you, Mr. Fader. And now, Mr. Nicola. We don't have a lot of time, please. Now, the next speaker is Mr. Nicola Abe, co-chair of the European Nation and Freedom Group.
Monsieur Zuckerberg.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, data protection is clearly a major issue for our citizens. And that's what the previous speakers have all focused on. But even more important is respect for fundamental freedoms. Your social network now has an almost monopoly position in many parts of the world. It creates dependency among internet users. Facebook is an algorithm, it's a platform for exchange and communication. It has a major impact on freedom of expression and freedom of information. Facebook's decisions are very important. For example, it's the same as banning a newspaper if you don't allow people to speak. You have decided to delete a number of false accounts, but I can tell you about real accounts that have been blocked. The French group's Génération Identitaire had its website on Facebook closed down because it had strong views but peaceful views about migration, and it had 200,000 followers. I think that this is very worrying and has a totalitarian implication. If you prevent people from consulting the pages of legal organizations, then you're preventing users from getting access to a plurality of opinions, the opinions that are present in our society. Imagine if a telephone operator decided to close down the numbers of people who didn't agree with the views of the company. There's one academic who's seen this as a privatization of our public liberties beyond any jurisdictional or parliamentary control. It is furthermore unacceptable that there's a kind of private sovereignty which competes with and challenges nation states. Mr. Zuckerberg, you have a responsibility towards the billions of users of your platform. It's a huge responsibility. So 2 questions. The arbitrary censorship carried out by Facebook, is it compatible with the fundamental values of our democracy? And by which legal criteria do you justify the decision to close down Facebook pages expressing legitimate opinions? And a third rapid question. The hunt for fake news is very fashionable right now, but hasn't that become a new excuse for further restricting freedoms of opinion and expression? Thank you.
4 speakers. Please, we need to respect the timing. The first is Mrs. Dodds, non-attached members. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg, for appearing here today. I am a member of this Parliament from Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom. And while many of my colleagues here today have focused on elections and the issues of Facebook and public policy, I want to take you in a slightly different direction in my question today. In a few weeks' time, a family within my constituency will mark the 3rd anniversary of the loss of their son to online bullying. His name was Ronan, and he was 17 years old when he died. He was the victim of a false Facebook account from online bullies who persuaded him to send an intimate photograph of himself and then asked for £3,000 in return for not posting this on his Facebook account. Ronan's family have been incredibly brave in publicising this case and in dealing with this situation. But this is only one example of the rise of false accounts within Facebook. And I would like you to tell us today what you're doing to stop the rise of false Facebook accounts, which deliberately target young and vulnerable people. Ronan clearly felt he had nowhere to go. Can you explain to us then as well, in light of this phenomenon, which is a terrible thing right across Europe, can you explain to us what you're doing to work with third-party organisations to try and educate people in safety in using the internet? And would you tell us whether or not you're content that other families represented around this room here today will have their children kept safe by the settings and default settings that you use on your particular site? Can I just very quickly also say we live in a Europe in the rise of anti-Semitism, in the rise of terrorism, much of it conducted and much of the information conducted online. In the last few weeks, you've said that you've taken down a lot of that hateful and offensive comment from your site. Can you tell us how you define acceptable comment on the site? What are the benchmarks you use, and whether or not Facebook actually is capable of regulating this for itself? Thank you.
And now, Mrs. Cecilia Wikström, Chair of the Conference of the Committee Chair. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you also for organizing and sharing this meeting with us tonight. Thanks to you, Mr. Zuckerberg, for having agreed to appear and to answer to our questions. We appreciate that a lot. It has been already stated many times, but it must be underlined again, that it is essential that EU citizens can trust that their integrity and their rights on the internet are being protected, especially since the EU new rules on data protection are entering into force in only 3 days as from now. I'd like to raise 2 questions to you, Mr. Zuckerberg. Firstly, the scandal involving Facebook and Cambridge Analytica is more than anything else an issue of ethics and values. You said in your intervention in the hearing with the US Congress, you repeated it here tonight, that Facebook is responsible for the content on the platform. Once Facebook requests other companies to delete users' data, does Facebook follow up to check compliance by these companies? And how will you ensure that this is really done? And secondly, I am convinced that EU citizens would like to know which specific measures that will be taken by Facebook to ensure that a scandal like this one, Cambridge Analytica, will not occur again. You have shared your vision in spirit on greater responsibility on what happens on the platform. But, Mr. Zuckerberg, can you guarantee to the millions of users, many of them EU citizens, that company will take all the necessary steps to ensure that civil rights and liberties according to EU standards and that Facebook fully will comply to the GDPR and when this will happen. It would be good to have a date when full compliance is ensured. Thank you.
And now, Mr. Moraes, Chair of the Libe Committee, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg, for being here, and we hope that our committee will examine further with Facebook executives and so on in depth. And this is for people who are watching this web stream and want a more in-depth investigation. I think Mr. Farage slightly characteristically talked about how prolific he was on Facebook. I may be the most modest user of Facebook in the room, but our committee is not modest in any way. We are celebrating this week GDPR, but I do want to mention that GDPR, in my view, and we have the rapporteur here, is not something that will impact entirely on your business model, and I think you know this. E-privacy is essential also, and there's a reason I mention e-privacy is because there is a regulatory framework here, and I want to mention something very obvious. You're not in the congressional hearing, you've come to the European Union, and there's a big difference, and the difference mentioned by some of my colleagues I want to make very explicit, and that is that we are here in terms of regulation, and the United States is here. And this gap is very obvious. It's obvious in our adequacy agreements. It's obvious in the day-to-day transactions we have between the continents. But for you, it is a real detailed question of how you will comply. Now, I know that you will say, of course, we're going to comply with GDPR, but it is a much bigger task than I think people are estimating, and no doubt the rapporteur will say something about that in a moment. Now, in your introduction, you spoke, I think, quite eloquently about what you thought was one of the key points, which was the app question. And I think you mentioned it because it is really the critical point. What I wanted to ask, and colleagues are talking about crowdsourcing questions, the question I've been asked by individuals, journalists and others, is whether the question of protection of privacy and the rules on Facebook apps, which you were asked in Congress, is actually the tip of the iceberg, or is there a bigger iceberg? Now, you're addressing this because it's important. So I really do need to repeat this because specifically, given that Facebook was forced to review the apps authorised on the platform, I'll be quick, President, I promise. This is the problem about going last, of course. Following this, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and now that I think you've blocked around 200 of these apps since the congressional hearings, you've come here having blocked 200 of them. I mean, isn't this, first of all, a clear signal that Facebook failed to protect the privacy of its users? We have 252 million, I think, in the European Union. That's more than in the United States. And it gives us the question of that you should really provide us with the detailed measures, and you have some of these, that Facebook will implement to ensure a thorough analysis of apps that are allowed on Facebook. And really, why did you not inform users of these problems to enable them to take measures to protect their data? And President, if you just allow me, the bottom line for you, I think, and for Facebook, is we need to know in Europe the true scale of the violations of users' data by third-party apps. We need to get an estimate of this. And we need to know what it means to commit to GDPR. If I just give you one example, the GDPR gives individuals the right to access and verify all the data a company holds on them. And that includes not just their profiles mentioned by another colleague, but also the marketing profiles, data that was not disclosed by the user but interpreted from his or her behaviour. Are you really going to give users full access to their marketing profiles? Are you going to do or complete all of the steps in GDPR, never mind e-privacy? And really want to just to say in conclusion here, the question of the difference between GDPR and what is in the United States, the gap must be closed. But for you, given that you are here, and I try to be brief because we will go in more depth, it's not just that you have to comply with GDPR, but you have to remember that you're here in the European Union where we created GDPR. So we ask you to make a legal and moral commitment, if you can, to uphold EU data protection law, to think about e-privacy, to protect the privacy of European users and the many millions of European citizens and non-Facebook users as well. And this is a moral and legal obligation and implementation. And I really ask you to think about this because you've come here not to Congress but to the European Union, and we have expectations. Thank you.
Last question, Mr. Albert. Rapporteur for the General Data Protection Regulation. You have the floor, Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg, for being with us here tonight. And I'll keep it as short as possible to also allow for all the questions to be answered, because I really think there have been many very important questions to be answered. So, three precise questions. First, I welcome a lot that Facebook is applying the principles of the GDPR in future globally in its global business. I think that is a very important step ahead. I hope that it is complying with the GDPR globally, because I could pose the question if you as a US consumer should not get equal treatment to EU users. I think many US colleagues or users will pose the same question soon. The first real question, will you, with Friday, the GDPR kicking in, assure that no Facebook user or future Facebook user has to give consent for the processing of personal data more than what is necessary to use the service? Because today we have very often the problem that there is a take it or leave it situation, and with the GDPR that is not really what we want to see anymore. You need to give consent for everything what is not necessary to use the service. Second, in the US Senate, you responded to this question. We collect some data for security purposes. So to one of the questions, we collect some data for security purposes and we keep it. Can you promise that this data, which you keep for security purposes, is not used for other services, for other purposes like targeted advertisement? And last but not least, repeatedly European courts have demanded the separation of users' data between Facebook and WhatsApp after your company has acquired WhatsApp. Will you promise to me and also the European WhatsApp and Facebook users that from Friday onwards there won't be any exchange or cross-use of users' personal data between the two services? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's important for us to be at the center of the political debate. For another time, the European Parliament is the heart of democracy in Europe. I think for this political debate is very, very important, not only for the European Parliament, but also for the European citizens. For this, I want to thank you for the question, and now the floor is yours, Mr. Zuckerberg.
All right. President Tajani and honorable members, you've raised a lot of important questions, and I'm going to try to use the remainder of our time to get through as many of them as I possibly can. A number of you asked questions around inappropriate content on Facebook in one form or another, whether that's hate speech or bullying or terrorism or different content, and how that relates to this, or fake accounts, and how this relates to this position and philosophy of needing to take a broader responsibility. First, let me be clear. The bottom line here is that hate speech, bullying, terror, violence, all this content has no place on our services. But in order to really execute that, we need to upgrade and do a better job of executing our policies. So if you look back at the history of how we've operated, when I got started in my dorm room in college, because it was just me and because we didn't have the AI tools at the time to be able to go look through a lot of the content and understand what was in violation of our community standards and what wasn't, our policy for most of the history of the company has been to have our community flag things for us and then us to look at them reactively. So if someone sees something that they thought might be hate speech or bullying, they would flag that and then we would look at that. And we've built up teams to manage that. But now we think that our responsibility is greater. And now sitting here in 2018, we have the ability to start developing more AI tools, which I'll get to in a moment, some more detail, to be able to flag more of the content up front. And now as a big company, we also have the ability to employ tens of thousands of people to go review more of this content. So if you look, for example, at terror content, one of the things that I'm proud of is that our AI systems now can flag 99% of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda related content that we end up taking down before any person in our community flags that for us. Another example is around bullying. We had this really unfortunate set of incidents when we first launched Facebook Live, where we saw that people were harming themselves or committing suicide on live. And we realized that we needed to do a much better job of addressing that quickly. So we built AI tools and tools to determine if someone was thinking about harm or suicide, hired 3,000 people to make it so that the response time that we could get to those live videos is now less than 10 minutes. And that has been one area where we've been able to significantly improve. But we're basically going through each of these areas, starting from the areas that are the most sensitive and have the highest risk of harm: terror, bullying, self-harm, election integrity, which is obviously extremely important, are prioritizing them first, but our goal over the coming years is going to get to developing the AI systems and hiring the staff necessary to be able to proactively review more of the content as it's coming into the system. We'll never be perfect on this. You know, our adversaries, especially on the election side, people who are trying to interfere, will have access to some of the same AI tools that we will. So it's an arms race, and we'll need to constantly be working to stay ahead. But our vision for how we should manage the system is going to move from one of reactive management as people in our community flag things to one where we're more proactively having systems look at the content, flag things for tens of thousands of people to review. And we're already making significant progress in doing that. Now, a number of you mentioned specifically issues around fake news. So I want to talk a little bit about our roadmap for addressing this, because the bottom line here is that nobody on Facebook or off Facebook wants fake news, right? No one will sit here and say that they want the information that they see to be false. So, you know, we've broken down the problem, and we think that there are three main sources of content that are problematic here. The first is just spam, which I touched on a little bit in my opening statement. And it's often, you know, it's not politically motivated or ideologically motivated, it's economically motivated. It's people who are just trying to make money by coming up with the most sensationalist content they can and putting it out there. So the way you fight this is the same roadmap that companies have used to fight email spam. You take away these spammers' profit motive, and then they go do something else. And we've done a number of things like preventing them from using Facebook ads, decreasing the distribution to do this. The second category is fighting fake accounts. Because what we found is that when people are using fake accounts on our system, there's less accountability, and they're more likely to spread bad information, misinformation, interact in ways that are interfering in elections and things like that. So we develop systems both to identify fake accounts as they're being registered, and we just released a transparency report where we said that we took down, I think it was in the first quarter of this year, about 580 million fake accounts. The vast majority within minutes of being registered, as our systems are able to identify that well. We also have a significant operation which is working on identifying fake accounts that get through that initial filter so we can identify them all once they're in the Facebook community. Our best estimate today, I think, is that it's a single-digit % of the accounts, but we're constantly working on improving our tools to be able to identify that, and that's extremely important as well. So you have spammers, you have fake accounts. The last category is people who are well-meaning, but just happen to share something that is provably false. And there, you know, we don't want to be in a position as Facebook of saying what is true or false. We think that that's not the right position for us to be in. So we want to work with third-party fact checkers, and we're public with who all the fact checkers are, to one of the questions that there was earlier. And if a number of third-party fact checkers all identify that a piece of news is provably false, then we'll append something to the story to make sure that we show more related content so that people can have a more rounded view or understand that fact checkers have marked that story is true, and we'll try to show it less. Now we're trying to roll that out around the world. That requires having specific fact-checking partners in every country and in every language. So we're constantly rolling out more each month, and we have a lot more to do here, and we know that there's a lot more to do there. All right. Then there were a number of questions around elections. So I know that there are a lot of important elections coming up in Europe. I think in 2019 and 2018 there were elections in Slovenia and Sweden, Latvia, Estonia, Belgium, Poland, and of course the European Parliament. And this is one of our top priorities as a company, is just making sure that we prevent anyone from trying to interfere in elections like the Russians were able to in the U.S. Presidential election in 2016. And I outlined some of the roadmap for that earlier. The game plan is a combination of building more AI tools to identify fake accounts that are trying to interfere and take them down, like we did in the French presidential election, where we identified and took down more than 30,000 accounts. A playbook of closer operation and cooperation with federal election commissions, like we executed in the German elections in 2017, and increased transparency, which we think is going to be very important. If you have the ads that every political actor or advertiser is trying to run to every audience be public, then there's just more accountability. And if someone is trying to do that as a fake account, it becomes more apparent. If someone as a legitimate political actor is just sending different messages to different groups, that will be transparent. So we think that greater accountability is important. And that set of transparency tools that we're building, we're going to be rolling out around the world globally this summer. So we're optimistic about that. We think that there's probably more to do to add on to those after the first version, but we think that first version is going to take us quite far as well. I think, okay, so then there were a number of questions about regulation. Some of the questions asked how I view regulation. I don't think the question here is whether or not there should be regulation. I think the question is, what is the right regulation? I think the internet is becoming increasingly important in people's lives. Some sort of regulation is important and inevitable, and the important thing is to get this right, and to make sure that we have regulatory frameworks that help protect people, that are flexible so that they allow for innovation, that don't inadvertently prevent new technologies like AI from being able to develop, and of course to make sure that that new startups, so the next student sitting in a college dorm room like I was 14 years ago doesn't have an undue burden on being able to build the next great products. So we think that that's really important, and that's an ongoing conversation that we look forward to participating in. There were a couple of questions around competition and how we view our role and our position as a platform here. And to that, I'd say a few things. One is, first is that we exist in a very competitive space where people use a lot of different tools for communication. Where the average person uses about 8 different tools for communication, ranging from all sorts of private messaging up to more broadcast mediums, to things where they're communicating with groups of people and all of their friends at once. So from where I sit, it feels like there are new competitors coming up every day. There are competitors that reach tens and hundreds of millions of people, and we're constantly needing to evolve our service in order to stay relevant and serve people well. So that feels like it's a competitive environment where there are many choices that people have. On the business side, the business model is advertising. Facebook today is about 6% of the global advertising market. So clearly advertisers also have a lot of choice in terms of where they choose to advertise. And that's an important lens to look at it from as well, although I think that you want to look at it both from the consumer choice perspective and the business choice. One thing that I want to add that I think often gets overlooked when you talk about competition is, around the world there are 70 million small businesses that use Facebook's tools to grow and reach customers. And in Europe alone, there are about 18 million small businesses that use Facebook tools, and as I said in my opening statement, about half of them have told us that they are hiring more people because of their use of our tools to be able to grow. So I think it's important not to lose track of, when you're thinking about competition, that there's the element in the internet space and in the advertising space But there's also the extremely pro-competitive effect of enabling all these small businesses to now have access to the same kinds of marketing and advertising tools and be able to reach customers in sophisticated technological ways that previously only large businesses had the means to do. And that's something that we're very proud of, that we can provide as something that levels the playing field. And I think when you're thinking about the overall ecosystem and competition there, I think that that's a very important part to take into account. There were a number of questions about taxes, so I want to touch on that briefly as well. Facebook has always paid taxes in all of the countries where we have operations set up. We pay all taxes required by law, and we invest heavily in Europe. Right? We're going to have more than 10,000 employees across Europe and 12 cities by the end of this year. We have we have data centers already in Sweden and Ireland, and we're building another one in Denmark that's going to be online in 2020. So we've always paid the taxes that the law requires, and we're making significant investments in terms of helping to build the economies in the countries here and to contribute to the innovation and job growth here as well. All right, let me see what else is there. Okay, there were a few questions about GDPR. The principles here are around control, transparency, and accountability. The idea, a number of you asked when we expect to be fully compliant with GDPR regulations. We do expect to be fully compliant on May 25th, so in 3 days from now. We've had a large team working on this inside Facebook to make sure that we're compliant. And one of the things that we've wanted to make sure in rolling this out is, because one of the things that the law requires here in Europe is that someone has to go through these extensive flows before they can use the service, starting on May 25th. And one of the pieces of feedback that we got from people in the community was that they didn't want to get roadblocked before being able to go see their friends' content. Right? If you're coming to Facebook because you want to share something, the last thing that we want is for someone to go through the flows quicker than they need to, and just click OK or no on a bunch of stuff because they just want to blow through that in order to get to what they were trying to do. So we've actually been rolling out the GDPR settings and flows for a while now, and a large percent of Europeans have already gone through them, and we've basically put the flows in front of people and given them the opportunity to dismiss them. Starting on May 25th, we will start requiring people to go through the flows before they can resume using our services. So a large percent of people, dozens of percents, have gone through the flows already, and we've gotten good feedback on that and how we've implemented that so far. Let me see if there's anything else that is important to touch on. There were a couple of questions about political bias that I want to touch on, because I think that this is a very important topic. As a couple of you mentioned, we are committed to being a platform for all ideas. That means that we want to make it so that people can come to our service and share any idea across the political spectrum. It's very important to me that we're a service that allows for a wide variety of political discourse. We view that as a big part of our responsibility, and I can commit to you here today that we have never and will not make decisions about what content is allowed or how we do ranking on the basis of a political orientation. So that's an important philosophical point for me that I'm proud to be able to commit to. There was a specific point around distribution and reduction of seeing people's content. And on that, what I'd just say is we've made a number of changes this year to make sure that we're showing people's friends and family and community content more than public content in general. So a lot of the feedback that we've heard from people is that they come to Facebook because they want to stay connected to people. We've also done a lot of well-being research. This wasn't a topic that came up today, but we're very focused on making sure that people's use of technology is good for people's well-being and is not taking away from it in some way. And all the research that we have shows that when you're using the internet to stay connected to people that you care about, that's good for your well-being. It's correlated with measures like increased measures of health and happiness and feeling more connected and less alone over time. But when you're just using Facebook or the internet overall to read news or passively consume videos, that isn't correlated with those same benefits to well-being. So because of that and because of feedback that we've received, we've made a number of shifts to the services to promote connecting with people's friends and family and communities more than public content. So that has led to reductions in distribution for public content, video, news, across the board, and is not targeting any specific political ideology. Is there anything else here?
Shadow profiles. Shadow profiles.
Compensation.
I got
sure.
Not
So
a single answer.
to your question, for the content that websites and apps send us, we think it's very important that people have the ability to clear this. So we just launched or just announced that we're building and will soon launch this clear history feature that allows you to clear all basic browsing history data. To your point about earlier around, how do we separate out the security data? It's very important that we don't have people who aren't Facebook users coming to our service and trying to scrape the public data that's available. So one of the ways that we do that is, people use our service, and even if they're not signed in, we need to understand how they're using the service to prevent bad activity. And that's, a big theme of today has been around making sure that we can do a better job of governing the system, keeping bad content out. One of the ways that we do that is by understanding how people are using the system.
But if you're not a Facebook user, how do you stop that data being transferred?
On the security side, we think it's important to keep it to protect people in our community. Were there any other themes that we want to get through? I mean, there's what's
about how you make sure that Cambridge Analytica wouldn't happen again.
Right, that's good. So there were a number of questions around whether Cambridge Analytica was the tip of the iceberg, or whether we expect there to be more apps that have misused data. On this, the good news with Cambridge Analytica is that the changes that we made back in 2014 would prevent a new app like Cambridge Analytica wasn't an app. It was an app developer who used the platform and then sold the data to Cambridge Analytica, which is a whole other thing. But it wouldn't be possible for an app developer to get access to that level of data since after our 2014 platform changes went into effect. But because there were a lot of different apps that were using the system before 2014 and before the changes went into effect in 2015, we think it's important now to go back and investigate every single app that had access to a large amount of people's personal data before we lock down the platform. So that's what we're in the process of doing. We've already investigated thousands of apps, and as I said earlier, we've taken down more than 200. There are many thousands more that we need to investigate. This is going to take many months. I do anticipate that there are going to be other apps that we find that we're going to want to take down, and this is why we're going now and doing this full investigation. This is part of our shift towards not just trying to manage the system reactively we've always had the ability for people in our community to flag apps that they thought were bad actors to us, and then we would look at them. We've had the ability to, and we've done audits of apps in the past. We've had a content review and app review team. But now what we're doing is taking a much more proactive approach. So rather than waiting for people in the community to flag for us that there may be issues, we are going through and investigating ourselves up front all the different apps that had access to a large amount of information. We are upfront reviewing every app that asks for access to additional people's information. And anywhere where we see any concerns, we're going to bring in third-party auditors to conduct a full audit to determine if there was any misuse of people's personal information. And if there was, we will ban those apps and tell everyone who is affected. I want to be sensitive to time because we are 15 minutes over the scheduled meeting. I think that I realize that there were a lot of specific questions that I didn't get to specifically answer, but going around and hearing the themes of what people are concerned about and had questions about, I think I was able to address the high-level areas in each, and I'll make sure that we follow up with each of you afterwards to make sure that your specific questions get addressed. And we're going to have someone come to do a full hearing soon to answer more of the technical questions as well. So thank you again for inviting me and for having me.
I think there was one question raised by Guy Verhofstadt, and that's linked to my question, and that's the separation of different services. And I think it's a very important question in this round, the market power of Facebook, and the question if you cross-use, for example, data between Facebook and WhatsApp. So it would be good if you say at least one word to that.
Will you allow users to escape targeted advertising? I mean, I asked you 6 yes and no questions. I got not a single answer. Yeah. And of course, well, you asked for this format, well, for a reason.
Okay. I'll make sure we follow up and get you answers to those.
Okay, I think I want to ask to you if it's possible to have right answer for any question from you in the next days.
Why not written answer? So I think that everybody of us can provide you or questions because we have all well prepared our interventions, so we have them on paper. We could, Mr. President, you collect them, you give them to the team of Mr. Zuckerberg or Mr. Zuckerberg himself, and we receive written answers on it. Because let's be honest, I have not so much. I don't think that the right way is to say, and now we're going to put it in Libe and so on. No, there are a number of questions that have been put by other colleagues that I want an answer to. That said, I'm anxious of this new brave new world that Mr. Zuckerberg has presented us. A brave new world where tens and tens of thousands of private people are scrutinizing us and are saying what is fake news, what is not fake news, what is hate speech, what is not hate speech.
Mr.
Don't
President,
you think that it is a public
the
task?
continuation of this discussion in this format as well as in the Liebe format. This is very obvious.
No, I think, first of all,
Collecting the question.
Okay, is it possible to have answer question by question to have a right answer by Mr. Zuckerberg in the next days for every question?
Written, yeah.
Okay.
Now, on competition, for example, a European antitrust thing, that's important. Do we need? I think we're going to push our antitrust agency to go into this if there is not a good answer to.
I think the problem is the timing. For me, it's possible to say, but there is a flight. But I think if Mr.
There is no flight. I come from France.
Yes, okay.
There are strikes. That's the only thing.
Sorry, I think this is the format. Do you agree, Mr. Zuckerberg, for right answer in the next days for a question by question? Is possible to have a right answer?
The questions that weren't answered today.
Yes, you have the question. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.